So thank you, Achilles. Thank you for your attention, just while everyone gets settled. So I'm Steve Erlanger. As Achilles said, am diplomatic correspondent for the New York Times in Europe. Used to do Washington. Used to be Jerusalem bureau chief too, so I think all of us are thinking as well tonight about what might happen in Israel-Iran conflict overnight. But we have in front of us, I think, a really important couple days. This is an opening panel, so I hope we can touch some regional themes that actually matter. As you can see, I won't introduce everybody because you've got programs and so on. We're going to talk about the state of democracy. Supposedly, more than 40% of the world heads toward the polls this year, 7 of the 10 most populous countries. But what is the state of democracy? I would say it's a little parlous. It's not in necessarily very good shape. I've tried to write an essay about democratic backsliding that you can read in the Times tomorrow. And we have challenges to democracy both within consolidated democracies in the West and other places like India, but also challenges from all kinds of strains and stresses. And it's very intriguing because the Economist intelligence unit every year does a survey of democracy. And this year, they judged that only 43 of the 70 elections taking place this year will be free and fair. So that's more than half, but 43 out of 70. They consider only 8% of the world's population lives in full-fledged democracies. 39.4% lives under authoritarian rule. And the US this year is considered a flawed democracy. I can't imagine why. Greece, however, was promoted this year to being a full-fledged democracy from a flawed democracy, though some Greeks here may also wonder why. But what we have is a really good panel that's pretty well spread regionally. And we're just going to go by alphabetical order. So first, we have Yamini Aiyar, who ran the Center for Policy Research in New Delhi, has just come to Brown University. And so, Yamini, why don't we begin with you? Tell us about the wonders of Indian democracy and South Asian democracy.
Thank you.
Its challenges.
Thank you. It's a pleasure and privilege to be here. I come from a region that in many ways tells us a story both of the vulnerabilities of democracy, but also gives us a little bit of hope, I think, of the resilience of democracy when citizens take control of democracy. Democracy was the founding glue of all our nations in the region against the backdrop of a bloody partition, religious communalization. It was the wisdom of our founding fathers that led our independence movement, which ensured that the foundations of democracy found its roots in all the countries of the region. And the act of voting has been a crucial element of what all citizens, definitely in my country, and I could say across the region, hold very dear. More Indians vote today than they did in 1950, in our first election, 1952. And importantly, unlike many Western democracies, the poorest Indians make sure that they go to the polling booth, often under very difficult circumstances, to cast their vote. The act of voting is deeply integrated to our understandings of citizenship and our relationship with the state. But, and I'll come to the Indian case as the example of this, democracy is very vulnerable. Our democratic institutions are fledgling. They are vulnerable to creeping authoritarianism, which is very much the context in which Indians voted in April, May, and early June this year against a backdrop of strongman leadership, not very different to what many other democracies across the world are experiencing. Strongman leadership that uses the coercive arms of the state in ways that undermine core democratic functions, whether it is the role of civil society, dealing with dissent, undermining opposition politicians, total control of media, political centralization of money and power, not very different to many other parts of the world. And like in different countries, social polarization in the Indian context, the political party that was running the government, the BJP, is undergirded by a religious majoritarian imagination that is exclusionary against the constitutional project. It looked in March this year when we were going to the polls that this was a done deal. The BJP and our cult of personality Prime Minister, Mr. Modi, was extremely popular and set a goal for achieving 400 seats, essentially total dominance in the lower house in our parliament. And on the eve of the elections, the chief opposition party, the Congress party, said its accounts were frozen. A couple of senior politicians who were leading subnational governments were thrown into jail. Right. It did look like this was an election that was to be won before it even took place. And certainly it was not appearing to be a fair election. This was not a level playing field.
Would you say that's the reason Modi didn't do as well as he, I mean, suddenly there was
absolutely.
a bit of revulsion?
Absolutely. Once our politicians went to people and the campaign unfolded, the realities of what authoritarianism can do in everyday lives became a very central part of what was on voters' minds. Right. You could see in the role that social media played in looking for alternative narratives to the dominant media narrative. The Constitution became a symbol that entered the realm of mass politics in the most populous state of India, Uttar Pradesh. The Constitution became the motif on the back of what the election was about. And even though the BJP and Prime Minister Modi have proved their resilience, he is back in power, the realities of what authoritarianism can do to our everyday lives and democracy was on voters' minds, as he didn't get the dominant response that he expected.
Great, thank you. I'd like to turn to Yves Leterme. Yves, despite his name, is from Flanders and a former Prime Minister of Belgium, member of the Club of Madrid. And in Europe, we've seen something sort of similar, for example, in Poland, right? I mean, we've seen a Law and Justice Party which was maybe pushed things a bit too far and was set back, but we also see other things happening in Europe that make some people question whether democracy is working as well as it should do. So we can talk about Belgium also, because one could ask the same question.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me here. On behalf of Club de Madrid, maybe to answer your initial remarks, to reply to them, and also to answer your question about, let's say, democracy, how it's faring in Europe, in the traditional European nations. I would like to focus on 5-6 elements. Number one, to start with a positive one, based on my observation, and I've been a very important consumer of electoral processes, standing for elections 15, 20 times. What I witness, my country and Europe as a whole, I think in the world, when you look at figures about who's coming to the ballot stations and how this evolution is, I think democracy is still very much in demand, which I think should be a very positive element. The problem is that the offer, when people ask for democracy, electoral democracy, liberal democracy, apparently there's a frustration with the offer formulated by political parties and by institutions. Number two, when we look at reasons, I think we should not underestimate that representative democracy in the very long run of times, in the very long time, is a phenomenon of, let's say, 150, 200 years. It was built up in the 19th century with institutions, parliaments, representation. We have the membership-based parties of the 20th centuries. And so I think now we encounter some difficulties to cope with new developments. For instance, I think it's no coincidence that we saw a mutually reinforcing dynamism of growing wealth, of development of welfare states after the Second World War. And this was kind of reinforcing the legitimacy of political decision-making. It was about the distribution of economic growth, the dividends of economic growth. It was about improving the welfare state. And this is kind of broken. This mutually reinforcing dynamics of progress from a socioeconomic point of view, from emancipation point of view, and education, in all kinds of freedoms and liberties, this is kind of broken. And now it's not so much about how to distribute the pluses, it's about how to share the burden of the challenges of continuing to have a sustainable economic development, limits to redistribution, the burden of climate change, the price of climate change. So that's the second element. We should not underestimate the frustration of growing number of people that their part of the pie is not growing anymore. 3, I think where Francis Fukuyama said I think it was in '89, the end of history, we all said afterwards this was a false statement. Yes, but it was on the other hand more or less the end of major dividing lines of the political debate. I would say that in that period of time, the battle between three different conceptions of how an economy can be organized was over. Collectivism was put aside, and there was a consensus. Since then, there is a consensus that the market economy with social corrections, with sustainability corrections, is the right recipe to organize a society. So this means that the traditional dividing lines have disappeared, socialists, liberals, and so on. As a reaction to that, I think that the political forces, more scattered than ever, tended to be becoming over-promising and under-delivering. Also with the fact that politics is pulling out of major domains where it played a very important role. 5, I think there is also, and this relates to the representative democracy built in the 19th century with this membership-based parties in the 20th century, what we see now is an ICT-driven Uberization of opinion-making. And there you see that political parties, how they have been traditionally organized as providers not only of candidates, but also of thought, ideology, of programs, they haven't really integrated this new way of opinion making and of debates that are more horizontal. Last but not least, and I stop, the illiberal democracies have, I think, benefited from the fact that traditional parties, and I plead guilty, I was part of a traditional Christian democratic leading party in Belgium, I think we have indeed, especially in the period 2000 to 2015, we have been hiding away too long of really naming the problems and saying that non-integrated migration, for instance, was an issue, that criminality had to be confronted in a more tough way. So I think these 5, 6 elements on the one hand explain, I think, why representative democracy is facing a crisis in all its parts. But on the other hand, things can be, to a very important extent, can be addressed. So that's then the optimist part.
I mean, I think your points are well taken. I mean, there is less economic growth in Europe than people thought there would be.
Not only in Europe.
Yeah, but I mean, when you compare GDP per capita in Europe compared to the United States over the last 25 years, it's really disintegrated. The migration issue, people's sense of what it is to be a Belgian or a French person has been altered. I mean, there are lots of issues here that are hard to unpack, and of course it's a more secular society anyway, so big religious-based parties, I mean basically Christian Democrats was a Christian Democratic Party, feel a little bit like last century's answer. And so what I'd like to do to move along is turn to Oliver Ropke, who's also a European, who is on the European Economic and Social Committee for the European Union. And I would ask you also perhaps to look at some places like Hungary, like Slovakia, where, as in a way with India, you have democracies that are being kind of centralized from within, sometimes with popular support, because people are elected as reformers, and once they're elected, then very often they reform the system in a way that basically suits them. Please,
Thank you, Stephen. Good evening, and thank you for having me here. Allow me to say one word about the slogan or the title, "A Moment of Truth and Democracy at Stake." Yes, I think I couldn't agree more with this, but we just discussed before a bit about the reasons. And I have to say, when you ask me about Slovakia, Hungary, it goes a bit along the former split of Europe in Western and Eastern Europe. I think we should overcome this, because I think this is not the case anymore. I look to my country, what happened 2 days ago. We can see that this is not a phenomenon we see only in ex-communist countries. Right. It's really, I would say, a virus that is spreading around the world, but also in Europe. So
explain to people where you're from and what you're talking about.
Actually, I'm from Austria. Okay. And we had the elections 2 days 2 days ago in Austria with a big rise of the far right. Mm-hmm. Now the strongest party in Austria. But let's not talk only about one country. Let's talk about the European elections. When we see the European elections, we can say in the end, well, there was a hard shift to the far right, to the populist, or we can say, well, we still have a quite strong majority of pro-democratic, pro-European parties. So you can also sit back and say, well, this is democracy. People turn out they cast their ballots. We had a relatively high voter turnout. So one of the reasons that we said before for the crisis of democracy, that people are not interested, it's not true. Also in Austria, in Germany, in recent elections, the voter turnout, the voter participation increased massively, but right-wing parties benefited from it. So it's I would say it's a bunch of reasons that we have, and also the question of economic reasons. You know, as a trade unionist, I'm convinced that social security and social justice is a good instrument, and it's somehow a guarantee against this. But it's not completely true. It's not completely true, because we see that also in countries where we don't have a particular severe economic or social situation, also the far right is on the rise. So there are other reasons. It's true. Migration is one of them. We have to say it. I think we underestimated the impact on many people of especially working people, I would say, in this respect. And we should say that democracy is not only about the process, it's also about the results. Yes. But if we talk about the process, I have to say, and here I defend my institution, the ESC, the European Economic and Social Committee, which is the institution or the representation of organized civil society. I think this is absolutely a precondition that we have democracy also between the elections, and that we have a vibrant civil society, social partners, strong social partners, and I would really make a strong plea for strong institutions. Yes. Not only strong rules, clear rules, but strong institutions that are capable to defend, or of defending themselves and of defending democracy. And here I think civil society, social partners play a crucial role. We defended in the upcoming, or in the run-up to the elections, we defended the rule of law, democracy. We reached out to civil society to motivate people to go to the elections. And in the end, I have to say, if you look to Europe, I think the EU is still the best instrument to defend democracy and the rule of law. So therefore, I think we should also look a bit beyond our borders in Europe. We should also start already now to empower civil society and structures, strong structures in candidate countries. We are reaching out to them. We involve them already now in our structure. We are the first institution.
I mean, part of what I see in Europe, what interests me is there's been a certain complacency among traditional parties. They don't get as many votes as they used to, so you end up with these coalitions of wildly different parties. But people have begun to realize that even the people who don't like you are voters, and they have the right to vote, and they're citizens, and they're not a basket of deplorables, as somebody once said. I think Europe's struggling with this a bit because it's a vision of how societies should work, which isn't very articulate always or filled out, but it's upset and angry about lots of issues. One can go through them. But I think this is the intriguing challenge for European democracy, which I believe in. I mean, I think it's quite strong. So, Luanda, I will mispronounce it, Khasso. The X in your language is very difficult. But Luanda is a constitutional lawyer from South Africa. Talk to us about the transition in South Africa, where it's gone well, where it's gone off the rails, and what lessons do we have?
I mean, me pursuing constitutional law is a direct result of coming of age in the 90s and witnessing this incredible period in our history. You know, the first president I can remember is Nelson Mandela, you know, and rethinking what we're going to call ourselves, you know, redesigning the flag. How do you create one nation out of the fragments of the past and create one law to address what happened in the past? So 2024 is a moment of truth for South Africa in the sense that it is the 30th anniversary of our democracy. It was also the 7th election. And our constitutional democracy was meant to be a transformative democracy, a transformative constitutional democracy, meaning that democracy had to change the material conditions of people's lives. You know, a metaphor that we use a lot, and it comes from our 4th constitution, not the one that's in place now, is the idea that a constitution like ours is meant to serve as a bridge. It is meant to take our nation from the past to the future. That is transformation and non-conformity with the past. What I've come to realize is we've had a revolution in South Africa. If revolution means changing regimes, we've had that. Transformation is something different from a revolution. Transformation requires a change of heart. And I don't know if democracy is a tool to changing hearts, if the Constitution is a tool to changing hearts. And a bit of background, you know, we know that colonialism, apartheid, wrought a lot of violence in South Africa. It brought on a lot of violent language that created a violent reality in terms of dehumanizing people, you know, entrenching anti-blackness, white supremacy. It came with stolen land being conquered in terms of land. And what a constitutional democracy like ours was meant to do was usher in a sense of moral citizenship for all people, to say that we are all human beings with rights and entitlements, you know, to the enjoyments and privileges that are set out in the Constitution, undisqualified by any feature of your humanhood. It was meant to change the material conditions of people's lives, to address the inequality and the impoverishment and the stolen land, right? And number 3, it was meant to change the spirit of the times, you know, in terms of how we talk about things, the stigma around certain things, right? And 30 years on, the question is, has our constitutional democracy done this? In so many ways, it has. It's created, you know, some people will say it's created a black middle class. We've built some houses. It's provided access to education like people like myself in so many ways. There's been a transfer of land, but only 25% of it now, right? So there's so many things that have, I would be lying that, you know, when people say that nothing has changed, things have changed, But so much remains unchanged. Democracy for me is meant to be about redistribution. It's meant to be about repair. You know, it is meant to be about a certain kind of consciousness in terms of even the quality of leaders that we have to be able to make this constitution real. You know, so I grew up thinking that, you know, we have to make it across this bridge, that having this constitution, our constitutional democracy is going to be a panacea, all our problems are going to be solved, but not quite. Do I believe that democracy is under threat? I don't like thinking in those terms. I grew up in a chaotic country. It's still a chaotic country. It's more chaotic, I would say, in certain respects, in terms of where we are now. And one of my favorite writers is Ta-Nehisi Coates, and he says, you know, the moral arc of the universe doesn't bend towards justice. It bends towards chaos. And I think for me, I don't want to moralize democracy. What I know from my country's history is that democracy is not the moral issue. What is the moral issue is freedom.
Yes.
And the way that people want to attain freedom evolves over time. And I think there should be an experimentation in terms of systems and what people want. And lastly, I'll say this. I read a book by Nate Hill. It's called The Wildness. It's about relationships, has nothing to do with democracy. And there's a line there that really stuck with me, and it's a line that comes up for me when we talk about democracy. It's especially from someone like myself, coming from South Africa, where democracy was meant to deliver this promise. And the question is, has that promise been fulfilled 30 years on? And that line says, believe with compassion, believe with curiosity. And I think a lot of people believe in ways that are unhelpful. I think when we look at our belief systems and electoral systems and all of that, believe with curiosity.
Yeah, I mean, because we talked a bit earlier, and we were talking about how it's so fresh in South Africa. Still, the exercise of voting is still a very precious thing. People regard it that way. But also, you know, one of the marks of democracy is you can change regimes, right? Relatively peacefully. You've sort of done that, right?
Not sort of. I think we've done that.
Yeah, well,
Every
exactly.
transition has been peaceful. And I will say that I am glad that we are not looking at democracy or voting as this precious thing anymore. And this year's results prove that there isn't a blind loyalty to things. There are no sacred cows, you know. Things have to practically make sense. Yes, we have this history that is quite storied and lends itself to myth-making. Even Nelson Mandela himself and the myth and all of that. I like the fact that we are becoming a little bit more sober, a little bit more unpredictable, because for me that shows a certain kind of maturity in our democracy. And I think, honestly, at 30, if you look at human development, 30 is when certain parts of your personality start to form for real. So that's what I'm curious about, of what is sort of forming permanently and what are we still unsettled about?
Right. I mean, one of the things that I just wanted to ask you all about, I mean, you can participate as you like, but I mean, one of the obvious challenges to democracy comes from, if you like, the more authoritarian world, the Russia-China notion, certainly the Chinese notion, that its style of collective authority is more efficient, brings more goods to individuals, is better for development, is in some ways fairer, and that individual rights that most democracies seek to protect are less important, I'm trying to be fair to the argument, than the collective communal good as defined by the party or by the authorities. So I'm curious whether you see this as a serious challenge, or is it myth-making? I mean, how do you see it?
So look, one of the reasons why India went down the path that it did in 2014 was because there was a general sense, I would say largely amongst elites that dominate public opinion, but it percolated through society, through large parts of Indian society, that we could do with a little bit less democracy. We'll take that risk if we get a lot of economic development. Right. There's a wonderful article by a columnist that came out 3 or 4 years ago that sort of scratches his head in this mea culpa way and says, I think that was a huge mistake. You cannot what matters most to societies like ours? Why was democracy, and why does democracy remain so resilient despite all the threats that it encounters? Is because it remains the glue in a very diverse society that creates a common sense of citizenship. It remains a foundational glue on which the logic of our modern nations, emergence as modern nation states came together. It is the glue of our constitutional project. And that remains deeply understood in the DNA of our societies. I do want to say one more thing, just responding to what a lot of colleagues here have said. I think there needs to be a serious think about the extent to which democratic institutions today remain relevant and genuinely representative of the urge of citizenry. I think it's the legitimacy of how political parties are responding to the challenges of society that is under question, which is why, certainly in my region, and we see it in many other parts of the world, when citizens are drawing on the democratic impulse to pressure the state and stake their claims, it is usually coming through non-party contexts. People are going to the streets because they don't see formal processes of democratic institutions, particularly political parties, that are funneling this cult of personality and a very centralized form of democratic participation as necessary sites of genuine representation. The biggest protests we've had in India in the last 5 years have been actively non-party political. They've gone to the streets. Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, we saw the emergence of a whole new political party in response. So there is also the first emergence of populism of this kind that we've seen in the last decade plus that has challenged democracy, was using democratic institutions to challenge elite plutocracies that had dominated democracy. And now I think we're seeing a new kind of mobilization that is challenging the fundamental, or questioning the fundamental institutions of democracy itself. And it's time for political parties and our politicians and society as a whole to have that conversation.
Because, I mean, this is, in a way, it's the same question about efficiency. I mean, you know, is the messiness of democracy in the end, I mean, maybe it's a little less efficient, but maybe in some ways it reflects societies better. And maybe the problem is, as you say, that the structure of how we take votes and turn them into political representation is beginning to fail us. Yves?
Just one very quick thing.
Okay.
One of the big slogans of the BJP in India is one nation. And that one nation has been legitimized on the back of efficiency. One nation, one tax, one nation, one election, one nation, one constitution. I mean, it's using efficiency as the thread, and that is something that we need to be very careful about, because efficiency does compromise the messiness and consensus building of democracy.
Yes. Yves, is there a European answer to this argument?
I think we're still in a situation where populations increasingly question the system, and so I think number one, people have over the last couple of decades increasingly been under the impression that the core tasks of public authorities to protect people, physical security, security about their own future, they got a feeling, and for different reasons, this was also a reality, opening the borders, free market economy, globalization. I think that lots of people in Europe are even today under the impression that, confronted with the failure of traditional political parties and to a certain extent governments, that they tend to be big on less important things and not big enough on crucial things, big on small and small on big things.
Yes.
And so I think that that's really a very important source of resentment. I live in Belgium. I live also in the neighborhoods in the suburbs of Paris. I can tell you the physical integrity, drugs issues, the state of the public domain and so on, which are essential tasks for public authorities. Once public authorities don't manage to prove their added value and to book results, to be effective, efficient, I think this really affects the trust of people in representative democracy and in governments. There's also, of course, this globalization, the era of globalization. We had, I think, 15, 20 years of increasing free trade, opening borders. And there it is right that you have, well, people that can cope with also the challenges of this, the people that are potentially from anywhere and can live anywhere and can fare well in all kinds of challenging situations, and then the people that feel like left over, that want to belong to some place, that want to be from somewhere. And there, of course, identity politics comes. And last but not least, and it comes back to the first one, but more on essential domains, you have legitimacy by votes, but you also have something like legitimacy by results. And some systems in the world, until now, they have proven to be able to obtain and to sustain a legitimacy, which I think we underestimate because of the massive economic results, socio-economic progress. And of course, I'm talking about China. So I think these are apart.
And then, of course, one of the problems China has is as those results lessen, Xi Jinping gets more and more anxious and more defensive about slowing economic growth and questioning whether the Chinese export model is functioning as well as it should with the rest of the world, which is buying less and investing less. So it's an interesting thing. We don't have tons of time, so forgive me. I just want to say that when I was covering the German elections, the Länder elections, one of the things people who voted for far-right parties said to me, you know, the people in Berlin, they think it's their job to save the world. We worry about ourselves. And so in a way, they would also admit that partly ideology and partly correctness, kind of political correctness, kept them from responding more efficiently to these anxieties, whether the anxieties were exaggerated, whether they were fed by propaganda or not. And I think this is a problem too. It's the, you know, we can't cover everything tonight, but it's a problem of information, disinformation, how you make your arguments, and this is something I think we need to watch in all societies.
If I may,
please.
I think what has been said before, democracy is not only about the process, about values.
Yes.
You should really see that these people that you mentioned, they want to see results. And here, I think the perception is that other systems can deliver without our values. I don't say that this is true on the opposite, but this is the perception. And when you speak about political correctness, I know this also, this perception, then they have the impression that we talk about our values, but not about really what matters for these people. And I think, or for all of us, and I think this is uncertainty. This is from my perspective, if we summarize this, the uncertainty, and we have to provide more security for them. And I think the second point is, you mentioned it, polarization and disinformation. We can see this, and I think we are still too naive in Europe, but also in other parts of the world. Recently, we've been to Brazil. We've seen that Lula has reestablished the structures that were totally dismantled by his predecessor. And now they're struggling with, let's say, if it's a billionaire or not a billionaire, but with a few people who really think with powerful social media they can undermine the judicial system. We are not here yet in Europe, but I think it goes step by step in this direction, and we have really to be capable to defend and to defend our institutions and our democracy. And I think we should not be naive if we talk about the nations that you mentioned, Russia, China.
Sure. Lwanda, I mean, seen from where you are, I mean, South Africa has been trying to, I'm going to take a leadership in the so-called global south, whatever that is, right? I mean, we kind of know what it is, but it's not all south, and it's certainly not all global. But part of it is a kind of built-in criticism of the transatlantic democratic world as it exists. I mean, and do you think it benefits from these divisions inside older democracies? Are there lessons being learned, or is this kind of more ideological showboating or something like that?
I think there are lessons being learned, and I'm not sure if what I'm going to say directly answers you, because it's something I wrote down for the previous.
It's not a very good question, actually.
I was thinking, as you know, you asked your earlier question. There's a judge that I used to work for, Albie Sachs, and he'll always say, you know, what's the best thing that apartheid produced? You know, what the best thing that came out of apartheid? I'm like, what, Albie? And he'll be like, anti-apartheid. And this idea of anti-apartheid, you know, what's on the extreme, the polar opposite of the system that they were living under, it would be something expressed in the Freedom Charter in 1955, you know, talking about the people shall govern, talking about peace and friendship. I think it's the only legal document in our country's history that features the word love. And then you have the poets also articulating what anti-apartheid is. And they talk about, may a tenderness survive. Out of all of this violence, may some kind of tenderness survive. So when I look at our democracy now, and I think of what anti-apartheid was meant to be, we're still very violent in so many ways. So that tenderness is struggling to emerge. And then when you think of, you know, love and all these aspirations, the people shall govern. There's so many, we had state capture that cost us billions of rands, where the government was responding to private interests and not their constituents, right? So in so many ways, you see this dissonance of what the dream was, what they imagined, and the reality that we're living under. And perhaps my final remark would be to say that as a constitutional lawyer, I've always seen the journey as across this bridge. And I think, you know, I'm part of maturing, part of, you know, turning 30 as a country is, I'm not so fascinated with bridges anymore. There's a thinker that I love, Bayo Kamalafe. He's like a philosopher, and he talks about how opening doors is not a thing for him, right? Because doors have structural integrity. It's things that you plan for. Right. Doors are meant to open. And same way as bridges are meant to take us from one point to the next. I think like him, I'm interested in the cracks that this moment presents, because through those cracks, we can perhaps, you know, it's not about finding guarantees or lasting solutions, as he says, but maybe new realities through these cracks.
Well, as I remember that Leonard Cohen song, that's how the light gets in.
Yes,
okay.
Love that.
I really thank you all. We've unfortunately run out of time, but I hope you'll join me. We've started a conversation. We're going to have it, more and more of it, tonight and tomorrow. So I think we've made a good beginning, thanks to my great panel. So thank you very much. Okay. And now, as we all leave, I'd like to introduce Seema Shah, who's head of the Democracy Assessment Unit of International IDEA, which does this democracy index. So, Seema.